I have been sitting for some time in the little red room, where I have at last lit a successful fire. The chimney seems to have got over its smoking fit. Perhaps it was just that the wood was too wet. I have read Lizzy's letter through twice. Of course, it is a silly, inconsistent woman's letter, half saying the opposite of what it is trying to say. Lizzy cannot quite refrain from offering herself. And of course she does, in answer to my deliberately cool missive, protest too much. A cleverer woman might have replied coolly and let me read between the lines. A cleverer woman, or a less sincere one. Lizzy's letter has its own little attempts at ambiguity, but they are transparent. Poor Lizzy. I cannot take the stuff about Gilbert Oppian too seriously, though I do feel cross with her for not having told me, and I feel she has broken her promise. Besides, what are their relations? Lizzy's proximity is surely enough, even now, to convert any man to heterosexuality. Her breasts are enough. Do they drink cocoa together in their dressing gowns? The whole thing is rather horrid. Of course, Gilbert is nothing. He is a man of twigs. I could crush him with one hand and take Lizzy with the other. I certainly cannot envisage any platonic love trio. From the date of Lizzy's letter, it appears to have been in the dog kennel for well over a week. On reflection, this seems to be no bad thing. If I had received it at once, I might have been tempted to write an ill-tempered or facetious reply by return of post. As it is, she has had a silence to reflect upon. It may be best to prolong the silence. However, to repeat Lizzy's own perfectly reasonable question, what do I want? Why do women take everything so intensely and make such a fuss? Why do they always demand definitions, explanations? There are in fact some quite shrewd guesses in her letter, and the quiet outburst of resentment has not escaped me. Those wounding and not wholly unjust observations have doubtless been stored up for a long time. Perhaps I do want a sort of retired, part-time, senior wife figure, like an aging ex-concubine in a harem who has become a friend, a companion who is taken for granted, to whom one is close, but not committed except by bonds of friendship. This need not preclude occasional love-making. In fact, the harem situation would suit me down to the ground. Why can't Lizzy be intelligent enough to understand? My letter said nothing about time and space. I simply thought of her and wanted to see her. But then she will start asking absolute questions. An experiment? Yes, why not? She knows how I hate exhibitions of emotion. But she pours it all out, all the same. She wants everything, does she? Well, she can't have it. And that, doubtless, is that. I feel no jealousy of Gilbert, but I feel a sort of envy of him. He is the clever one. He has got simple Lizzy as his sweet, affectionate housekeeper, and meanwhile I very much doubt whether he has given up hunting. I must confess I still have feelings of ownership over Lizzy. She has lasted in my mind. Yet she is quite right. Loving shows like one's slip showing, as I once said to her when her slip was showing. How these girls do treasure up one's words. I have neglected her. I have even been cruel, though that could be called a sign of love, and the neglect a sign of trust. I do in fact recall the business of the taxi after Sydney's luncheon. I saw that Lizzy was scheming to leave with me, but at the last moment I quite deliberately brought Nell Pickering along too. Nell is the new musical comedy star with whom I had been flirting all through lunch. Nell is 22. I wouldn't mind having her in my harem. Poor Lizzy. What made me suddenly write that teasing, semi-serious letter to her, I wonder? Some fear of loneliness and death, which has come to me out of the sea. Since the subject of Lizzy Shearer has come up, I may as well give some further account of her. I began to love Lizzy after I realized how much she loved me. As does sometimes happen, her love impressed me, then attracted me. I was directing a season of Shakespeare. She fell in love with me during Romeo and Juliet. She revealed her love during Twelfth Night. We got to know each other during A Midsummer Night's Dream. Then, but that was later, I began to love her during The Tempest, and, but that was later still, I left her during Measure for Measure, when Aloysius Bull was playing the Duke. I recall very clearly that occasion when I first realized that Lizzy loved me. She was playing viola. This was during Lizzy's brief shining period, her annus mirabilis. It was the production in which Wilfred Dunning, who usually played Sir Toby Belch, suddenly insisted on playing Malvolio. At least, he did not insist. I let him. It was a marvel, but it wrecked the production. Lizzy and I were alone in a rather draughty church hall, which for some reason was all we could get at that moment to rehearse in. It was a winter's evening, and I remember the place as being lit with gas. Lizzy, now in Act 2, Scene 4, got as far as "she never told her love." Then she stopped and seemed to choke, and uttered no more. I thought at first that this was her own extremely effective idea of how to speak the speech, and I waited for her to go on. She gazed at me. Then huge glistening tears rose into her eyes. When I realized what the matter was, I began to laugh and laugh and laugh, and after a bit Lizzy laughed, laughing and crying helplessly. And I loved her for that laughter too. She was a good girl. She is a good girl. I somehow always picture Lizzy in breeches. She first won a little fame as principal boy in small provincial pantomimes. She was very slim in those days and rather boyish in appearance, and used to stride around in boots and cut her hair very short. Her great ambition, never realized, was to play Peter Pan. She was, briefly, quite serviceable as Shakespeare's transvestite girls. Sidney later directed her as Rosalind. I made her into an adorable Viola. But her greatest success in that historic season was as Pug. In Romeo and Juliet, she was a mute lady. I forget who played Juliet, except that she was no good. I was touched by her love and by her superb obedience, but I was tied up with Rosina at the time, and I saw Lizzy as a wispish, enchanting, rather infantile sprite. Every time I met her, I laughed, and then she laughed too. We used to laugh at each other across restaurants, and suddenly and mysteriously during rehearsals. I did not need to be told how much she loved me, though she never, even on the first occasion, said anything about it. I thought that was stylish of her. Throughout the dream, her radiant gaze rested on me. Her will touched my will, and trembled. She understood and obeyed, and although, as she told me later, she knew about Rosina, she existed in a sort of heaven of suffering, which I must confess gave me some gratification. Perhaps this gratification was a prophetic gleam from the love I was later to feel for her, and by then I was getting thoroughly tired of Rosina. In that production of the dream, Al Bull, a most uneven actor, played Oberon rather boorishly, and I regretted not taking the part myself. Lizzy's cup would then have been full and running over. It was at the end of that season that I went to America, and there followed the horrible interlude in Hollywood and the first debacle with Fritzi Eitel. I think I went to Hollywood partly to escape from Rosina. In any case, I escaped. Rosina thought I left her because of Lizzy, but this was not so. When I came back to England again, there was suddenly an interval of peace and an atmosphere of restored innocence and joy. It was summer. I was on good terms with Clement, who had one of her silly young men at the time. I felt, after the horrors of California, free and happy. I wanted to get back to Shakespeare after the muck I had been wading through in America. A fly-by-night American director called Isaiah Mommsen let me play Prospero. It was the last substantial part I ever played. Lizzy was Ariel. She was the most spiritual, most curiously accurate Ariel I ever saw. Her love for me made her so, and in the midst of all that magic made me love her. Oddly, I felt then, and the feeling remains with me, that I loved her as if she were my son. She often called herself my page. She had a pretty little singing voice, and I can still hear the thin, true tone of her full fathom 5. How now, after all these years, my tricksy spirit? I remember that she once played Cherubino in an amateur production of Figaro, and I think this tiny success is one of the things she valued most. Damn, it has just occurred to me that Gilbert Oppian probably regards her as a boy. My love for Lizzy was somehow an innocent love. God, what messes I got into with Rita and Rosina and Jean and Doris and the rest. The innocence was Lizzy's pure gift. Her love was so scrupulous, so intelligent. She never used her power to lay upon me the lightest of moral bonds. The reader will say, but the bonds were there. Well, yes, and yet some grace born of Lizzy's selflessness seemed almost to abolish them, and we lived in the golden world. Of course, she never approached me. It was as if she positively did not want me to feel any sense of duty towards her, but wanted me simply to use her for my happiness. Written so, this sounds crude. But as we lived it, it was the profoundest, humblest tact on her part, and on mine, a love that was composed of gentle gratitude. We were gentle with each other. And yet, of course, it was also at the same time a scene of carnage. Why do I so much enjoy writing this down? I told her from the start that I had no conception of marrying her. Was it blind, stupid hope, nevertheless, which made her so infinitely kind to me? An ungrateful thought. I am sure she had no hope. I told her that the affair was temporary, that my love for her was temporary, and doubtless her love for me was temporary. I spoke of mortality and the fragile and shadowy nature of human arrangements, and the jumbled unreality of human minds, while her large, light brown eyes spoke to me of the eternal. She said, "I want to be perfect for you so that you can leave me without pain," and this perfect expression of love simply irritated me. She said, "I will wait forever, although I know I am not waiting for anything." What a love duet, and how much I enjoyed it, although in her suffering I suffered a little too. Certainly she concealed her pain as much as she could, but towards the end it was impossible. She cried before me with wide open eyes, not staunching the tears. Her tears fell on my sleeve, on my hand like storm rain, and when at last I told her to go, she went like a shadow, with silent, swift obedience. After that I went on my second visit to Japan. The taste of sake still makes me remember Lizzy's tears. She never prospered in the theatre after I went away. All the ladies went downhill after I left them, except Rosina. Clement, of course, I never really left, even when we both had other lovers, which was rather horrid for the other lovers. 2 years after Lizzy's apotheosis as Ariel, they were asking, "Whatever happened to Lizzy Scherer?" I was so grateful to her, and this alone has made her last in my mind. The dear girl never made me feel guilty. A light of courage and truth shines on her in my memory. She is possibly the only woman, with one exception, who never lied to me. And the remembrance of her sufferings often filled me with a kind of tender joy, whereas when I think of the sufferings of other women, I tend to feel indifference, even annoyance. I wanted a wife once, when I was young, but the girl fled. Since then, I have never really seriously thought of marriage. My observation of the state never made me fancy it. The only happily married couples I know at all well are my Cambridge friends, Victor and Julia Banstead, and in the theatre, Sydney and Rosemary Ashe. And even they, who knows? People are so secretive. I might also count Will and Adelaide Bowes, but they only survive because she gives in all the time, which I suppose is one method. What suits me best is the drama of separation, of looking forward to assignations and rendezvous. I cannot prefer the awful eternal presence of marriage to the magic of meetings and partings. I do not even care for sharing a bed, and I rarely want to spend the whole night with a woman I have made love to. In the morning she looks to me like a whore. Marriage is a sort of brainwashing which breaks the mind into the acceptance of so many horrors. How untidy and ugly and charmless married people often let themselves become without even noticing it. I sometimes reflect on these horrors simply in order to delight myself by thinking how I have escaped them. In this respect, Clement understood me perfectly, perhaps because she was always so excessively conscious of being old enough to be my mother. How often, glowing with that famous beauty and charm which she retained for so long, she battered me with that phrase. We knew that we would never marry, and we knew that we would make each other suffer, yet we schemed for our happiness. We really used our joint intelligence on that problem. Of course, in a way, it was a hopeless case, but it was a hopeless case which marvelously lasted for the rest of Clement's life. So I did not do too badly by that wonderful, maddening woman. Was I a little cruel to her, never quite saying how much I loved her? Always trying to keep her on the hop, puzzled, baffled, at a disadvantage? Perhaps. I was afraid of being swallowed. I went away. I came back. I went away again. She was not alone either. She was always beset. I was never terribly jealous, except perhaps for a short while, of Marcus, because I had such a close connection with Clement, just as if, though I never used these words to her, she were indeed my mother. She became very irritable and possessive in the last years, and she went on so touchingly trying to please me. She could not stop flirting. When she was ill, she became rather hideous towards the end, and had to be lied to about her appearance. She lost her figure and went about in corduroy trousers and a baggy jacket. She looked like an old bachelor with drink stains and snuff all down her clothes. Yet still she would spend an hour a day doing her face. Perhaps that is the last pleasure which a woman leaves. No, I never considered marriage. That first girl made all the rest seem shoddy. Or perhaps it was just the comparison with Shakespeare's heroines. I am writing this after dinner. For dinner I had an egg poached in hot scrambled egg, then the coley braised with onions and lightly dusted with curry powder, and served with a little tomato ketchup and mustard. Only a fool despises tomato ketchup. Then a heavenly rice pudding. It is fairly easy to make very good rice pudding, but how often do you meet one? I drank half a bottle of Merceau to salute the coley. I am running out of wine. Lizzy. Yes, she has stayed the course. I have felt more passion with less comfort elsewhere. The mysterious, deep, half-blind preferences of human beings for each other, the quick probing tentacles that seek in the dark. Why one inexplicably and yet certainly loves A, and is indifferent to B. I was at ease with Lizzy. Her gentle, clever teasing made me feel free. Yes, the final question is, how much does one crave for someone's company? That is more radical. It matters more than passion, or admiration, or love. And am I wondering who will cherish me when I am old and frightened? On the whole, I am rather relieved that her letter can be taken as a simple negative. No more anxieties and decisions. I shall let the matter drift. As for Gilbert, that waterfly, he is not near my conscience. I rather wonder at Lizzie's touching belief in him. It is true that I could put a most terrible pressure upon both of them, but of course I shall not. No doubt I have done enough damage by simply reminding poor Lizzy of my existence. Do you know what a poltergeist is, Mr. Arkwright? Mr. Arkwright allows a scornful interval to pass while he slowly mops the counter. His silence does not connote hesitation. Yes, sir. The sir is sarcastic, not respectful. Did you ever hear that there was one at Shrough End? No, sir. Oh, what? What did he say? Asks one of the clients. A poltergeist, says Mr. Arkwright. It's a sort of a... He cannot quite say, so I come in. It's a kind of ghost that breaks things. A ghost? There is a significant silence. You never heard that Shrough End was haunted? Any house might be haunted, someone volunteers. Mrs. Chorney haunted it, someone else says. She looked like a... The simile remains elusive. I leave the matter there. My question to Mr. Arkwright was not prompted solely by the fate of my ugly vase. Something rather frightful happened last night. I was wakened at about 5:30, as it turned out, by a most fearful shattering crash down below. It was already daylight, but the hall and stairs are dark, so I lit a candle. I went down, thoroughly frightened, I must confess, and found that the big oval mirror in the hall had fallen to the ground. The glass was shattered into tiny pieces. What is odd is that both the wire at the back of the mirror and the nail, which remained in the wall, appeared to be intact. I was so appalled and upset I did not stop to investigate properly, and I was afraid that my candle would go out. There was a surprisingly strong draught. I returned promptly to bed. This morning I rather stupidly pulled the nail out of the wall and threw it away without inspecting it properly. Of course, the nail must have been gradually bent by the weight of the mirror until the wire slipped over the end. I feel curiously unwilling to reflect about the matter in detail. I am very sorry about the mirror. The frame is undamaged, and it can be reglazed, but the original glass was mysteriously silvery and beautiful. It took me some time to get to sleep after the crash, and I left my candle burning in the dawn light. When at last I fell asleep, I dreamt that Mrs. Chorney had come out through a door in the alcove to ask me what I was doing in her house. She looked like a